So we'll talk about Frank O'Hara's poem, Why I Am Not a Painter. And I'll read it and then we can just go with it. Here we go. And I can't do justice to O'Hara's reading. He has a very special, but we don't have a recording of him reading this poem that I know of. Why I am not a painter. I am not a painter. I am a poet. Why? I think I would rather be a painter, but I am not. Well, for instance, Mike Goldberg is starting a painting. I drop in, sit down and have a drink, he says. I drink. We drink. I look up. You have sardines in it. Yes, it needed something there. Oh. I go and the days go by and I drop in again. The painting is going on and I go and the days go by. I drop in. The painting is finished. Where's sardines? All that's left is just letters. It was too much, Mike says. But me? One day I am thinking of a color, orange. I write a line about orange. Pretty soon it is a whole page of words, not lines, then another page. There should be so much more, not of orange, of words, of how terrible orange is and life. Days go by. It is even in prose. I am a real poet. My poem is finished and I haven't mentioned orange yet. It's 12 poems. I call it Oranges. And one day in a gallery, I see Mike's painting called Sardines. Well, it's a fun poem, and yet it's also very complicated. Let's focus on the fun. Max, why is this a fun poem?
Well, we get a good glimpse of this New York school world. We see Frank hanging out with Mike Goldberg, who's a real life painter,
abstract expressionist.
They're both sort of doing their New York art world thing.
And what's that? You're envious, aren't you?
Oh, well, a little bit, I guess. They seem to be having.
Where are they?
They're in Manhattan.
But Frank says, I drop in. Drop in where?
It drops into Mike's studio,
yeah.
Which apparently has a well-stocked bar.
I think so, yes. They have a drink while he's painting.
Yeah.
No envy there at all?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a great... They're just...
What kind of life is that?
It's a life that's no longer available to many of us, I would say.
Dave, what, to the extent that you're envious of this life, what would you see in it that's fun and exciting?
Just hanging out during the process of creation of art and drinking.
And talking about the art as it goes, as it happens, right? Amaris, I don't even know the question I'm going to ask you, but it's something about the process. What's the difference between the fun of arriving at some artist friend's studio and seeing the finished work that you didn't know about prior? What's the difference between that fun and the fun of dropping in and seeing it as it's made?
I mean, they get to compare each other's processes of painting and poetry, and so there's sort of cross-pollination that occurs. Frank O'Hara is inspired by Mike Goldberg's Sardines poem, but also is able to see all the differences between writing and painting.
There's something slightly not right about what Amaris said, Anna or Molly. I mean, she was great, as usual. But in this poem, I just noticed this, Molly. In this poem, Frank, the poet, drops in to Goldberg, who's got a studio. You have to have a big studio if you're Mike Goldberg. It needs space, room for paint, room for the bar. He drops in and watches and participates in a colloquy about the painting process. But when the third stanza comes, but me, one day I'm thinking of a color, you don't have the sense that Mike Goldberg is dropping in on the poem. Why? I mean, they are collaborating, and I think there is an influence on race. I'm not saying you're wrong about that, because clearly O'Hara's poem is influenced by his experience of watching Sardines in the making, the painting. Molly, why doesn't Goldberg drop in on the poem being made?
Maybe because the making of a poem is not a visual aesthetic process.
There's no big studio. He probably writes it in coffee shops and in the corner of his apartment with his typewriter, and there's really nothing to see.
It's very interior.
Do you think that might be why? I've never really thought about this. I've taught this poem for years, and I've never thought about this. Do you think that might be one of the reasons why he's a poet and not a painter? Could be. I guess we should come back to that. Okay, so Sardines. Let's talk about the painting. What's in it? from what we want to know here. I know you've all Googled it and you've seen it, and it really exists. Just Mike Goldberg sardines, and you'll probably get an image of it. But what about in the poem, Max? What do we know about this painting?
It begins presumably with a sardine can and eventually gets covered over in Goldberg's action painting
A sardine
process.
can that's a can that's actually pressed and glued to the canvas? No.
No. The image, an image
A
of a sardine.
depiction of a
Yes.
sardine can.
Yes.
We got to be very
Yes,
right
okay,
because
right, because he is an assemblage kind of guy. Yeah.
because if I put this mug in a painting,
Sure.
right, that's mug. But if I put the representation of a mug in the painting, that's
It's
different.
probably a picture of a sardine can and it says sardines on the side.
Okay, so that's why Frank is able to say, "Hey, Mike, pretty cool painting. You've got sardines in it." Now, sardines in the poem is all caps. What does that mean, Anna?
It's like the lettering.
Yes, it's the font, the iconography, or the iconic depiction of the. Okay, so he's not just reproducing the word sardines. It's not really lexical in that sense. It's almost like
It's
an
also like
advertising.
it's branding.
It's a brand. Thanks. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah, you're proud of yourself. You thought of that word. Sardine brand. Okay. So now he has sardines, and why when Frank, the poet, asked the painter, "Why did you put sardines in it?" or "You have sardines in it," Mike says it needed something there. Allie, that's a very funny comment to make. Not a classic painter, is he? Huh?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't have that much personal insight into different people's painting processes.
Well, what do you think it
but
means? Since you use the language every day, people talk like this, and yeah, it needed something there. What does that mean? What is that locution, that idiom? It needed something.
I mean, there was something missing, like in the image that he was in the process of making, and so he just decided to
Added it. There's a
put
certain
that there.
serendipity about that. Emily, yeah?
It's referring to a particular sort of paradigm of composition and a particular sort of relationship to composition where composition determines the content rather than the content determines the composition.
Very nice. So it needed something there, and Frank says, "Oh," and he goes, and days go by. Why is he using present tense? We've talked about this in relation to O'Hara. Amaris, why present tense?
Well, Frank O'Hara is known for doing an "I do this, I do that" sort of style to his poetry. He uses colloquial language, and so in the present, it keeps us in the moment.
Mm-hmm. And Dave, what does it emphasize? This "I go" and the days go by, and I drop in again. The painting is going on, and I go. It sounds like the painting and the poet are doing the same kind of going. What does that mean?
I think it depicts the passage of time,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that a poem can do very easily, which may be different than a painting.
Well, you're jumping to the conclusion right away, but you're famous for that. You're going right to the end. Let's come back to that. But why? How does the process of the painting being made get emphasized here? This is kind of an obvious question. Dave.
Just by showing the process unfolding over time. It's here, it's got sardines in it. Oh, no, it doesn't have sardines in it. We're just taking through the process of what's going on.
And Anna, when the painting is finished, Frank says, "Where's sardines?"
All it's left is just the letters.
What does that mean? That's not clear, is it?
I guess to me, I always sort of like imagine that it means that, like when Max is saying, the sardine can has kind of disappeared. Now all we have left is just like that lettering.
So this is great. This is a great thing about words, right? I mean, this is really linguistics. When he says, "Where's sardines?" he means, where's the brand on the can, which is just what you said. I'm just emphasizing what you just said. And all that's left is just letters, meaning you can break a word that's iconic, that's brandish, and make it just letters. But so the painting is still poem-like. It's still participating in the ut pictura poesis. As in painting, so in poems, as in poems, so in painting. Right? It's still participating in that sister arts collaboration, except that we've gone from the imagistic depiction of sardines as a brand, as a can, to just the letters. In a way, it's almost become more poem-like. And then Mike says it was too much. Molly, what does he mean by that? Mike says it was too much.
The entirety of the can or of the brand was too much for the painting. It sounds like he covered up a lot of it. maybe to make it more subtle, to make it more
So
abstract.
too what? Too much what? Max, too...
It was too referential, perhaps.
Too
You could tell
referential.
that it was a can of sardine.
Too much
Okay.
specificity.
Too what?
Too much specificity.
Too much specificity, too obvious. Amaris, too what?
I guess too familiar and recognizable. The word
Too
draws your
recognizable. This
eye.
is an abstract expressionist. You can't just...
Yeah, you would think that the word sort of takes on the quality of an image when it's in a painting, but it also has that representational, referential quality that Max was talking about that makes you think of sardines. And
Okay, let's see where we are. The first stanza presents the general case. I'm not a painter, I'm a poet. I think I'd rather be a painter, but I am not. And the poem is called Why I Am Not. So it sets up the story. Then he says, well, comma, and then the second stanza is about Mike Goldberg's process of doing a painting that has a little quality of poem in it. Letters, words. Then the third stanza begins, but me, and what does that do, Max?
He's pointing back to himself. I mean, this is the counter argument here in this case.
But me, I do something different, or maybe I do something similar, but I'm going to tell you how I do it. So the first stanza is a presentation of the case. The second stanza is the experience of watching Mike do a painting with poetic qualities. And the third stanza is the poet writing a poem with painterly qualities. And what are the painterly qualities?
Well, he starts off by thinking of a color.
And the color is orange. Okay. And he seems to be writing a lot about oranges, but then to our surprise, the poem is finished just as the painting is finished, almost exactly at that point in the stanza above. The poem is finished, and it turns out he hasn't mentioned orange yet. Now, how could that be possible? Emily, how is it possible that this poem how could any piece of art be about orange but not mention orange?
It depends on what you think about really means
No.
and how you're invoking oranges in this case. If you're trying to represent them or not.
So if you're thinking about the vacation, that great vacation, you ever been to Hawaii,
Sorry.
California?
No, I'm afraid not.
You've never been out of Philadelphia, basically.
No, I've never been out of the writer's house.
Well, let's imagine that you went to Hawaii when you were 13 and you had a wonderful experience. And so you decide to write a poem about Hawaii, and all you can ever think of while you're writing this poem is Hawaii, Hawaii, Hawaii. But you never mention Hawaii in the poem. It's still about Hawaii, because Hawaii was what?
It's a sort of a vision of some ideal place, of some sort of ideal vacation.
Okay, and in the world of poetry, what would we say Hawaii is in that poem that doesn't mention it?
The inspiration.
Inspiration or a concept.
Right.
Okay, so we think orange is in the poem, but it's not. Oh, by the way, what does this prove? Because orange is in this poem, but it's not in the poem that he says he was writing in this poem. Uh-oh, what does that mean?
Well, I
Amaris?
think he's trying to sway the attention from the object or what we think the poem would be about
Which
to
poem?
the materials.
The poem that's told in
Both
this
the
poem?
poem that he's describing
And
in
this
the
poem.
and this current poem.
But this poem has oranges in it,
Right,
but it's not
because-
called oranges.
Right,
It's
because-
called Why I'm Not a Painter.
He's drawing attention to the materials that he's using. So, whereas in painting it would be the color, here it is that word that gets used to describe his process.
Okay, so what about this poem? We know that this poem is a poem about a painting that has poetic qualities. And we know that this poem is about a poem, not this poem, but another poem that has painterly qualities. But this poem, I almost want a fourth stanza that says, but this? What am I doing here? Because what he's saying with but me is, but me when I write a poem, not this poem, but another poem? So that other poem is metapoetic, and that other poem, the poem Orange is mentioned in this poem, is metapoetic how? Is it hard?
It's a little hard.
Why is that poem metapoetic? Oranges. Why is Mike Goldberg's painting metapainterly?
Because I mean, when he talks about the whole he gives us the whole process.
Right,
of
it's
it.
process oriented. So it is a painting that embeds in it the process by which the painting occurred, and the emphasis in the description of the process of the painting being made in this poem is an emphasis on the process by which the painting got made. So the painting is a painting that has poetic qualities in it, and it is the kind of painting that is best understood as a process. So, I mean, one easy way to do this is that all postmodern painting is meta painting. Okay, it's meta painting because its process is embedded in its making. You see what's left of the sardines. Okay, and the poem, not this poem, but the poem Oranges, how is that a meta poem?
Because it's all process and no representation.
Yeah, it's not representing oranges. It's about oranges, but it's about how you write a poem about oranges without depicting or representing.
And all the associations that you start with and then end up with, you know.
Yes, so this is, our heads are exploding. This is complicated. So we have a poem here, we'll talk about in a second. This poem is about a painting that uses poetic qualities to emphasize its meta-painterly qualities. And this poem is also about a poem, not this poem, but another poem, that is painterly and participates in the painterly process and is meta-poetic. What about this poem?
It's meta-poetic.
You wanted to say that. It's double meta. It's meta-meta. Now, everyone seeing this conversation at this point is going to stop and say, these people are so full of shit. Won't they?
Yes.
Meta. But they're wrong. I mean, they're not wrong that we are full of shit, but not in this case. All right? So here we are. Here we go. This is a poem about a painting that behaves like a poem and a poem that behaves like a painting. This is a poem that shows how you can have a meta painting in a poem and how you can have a meta poem in a poem. And it's also a poem about how only a poem can be a meta poem by having a meta painting in it and a meta poem in it. A painting can't do that. A painting can go to the first meta level, but a poem can compare two meta processes and leave them both there and never erase one or the other. Okay, either that sounded like total bullshit or we are onto something. Which? Dave?
We're definitely onto something.
You're just saying that to please me. Can you say a little more?
No, I agree. There's a lot of differences that this process of this poem points to that highlight the difference between what a poem can do and what a painting can do. And leaving it all on the page is one way that a poem can do this in a way that a painting can't.
Where's sardines? It's not all that's left is letters. Where's oranges? Well, they're still there. They're here. This is a poem that gave us the thing that the poem can't represent, and it's not representing anything. It's a process poem. So I'm not saying you have to agree with this, or that anybody watching this discussion needs to agree with this. But the reason that he's not a painter is because a poem can go that step further. Let's just say that it's such a complicated idea. I want to spend a few more minutes just saying that again, and then we'll stop. Max, add to it any way you want.
Sure. Well, we were saying earlier about the sort of upper limits of painting, and the painting actually ends in the middle of this poem, and the poem goes on, which is really great. We're talking about the space of the painting that you need to fill with the space of this studio, but this poem goes on and almost begs, I think as you said a minute ago, Al, almost begs this sort of extra meta poem, another process poem about Frank O'Hara writing Why I Am Not a Painter.
Yeah.
And so it exists like firmly in this continuous present of O'Hara's world.
Yes,
Poetry is life.
the painting can do this. Second and third stanzas in parallel. The painting can do what the poem does almost. I mean, Dave is saying there's a little more here, but we're basically going to do the same. But a painting can't do what this is. Painting can't do this. Remember, Mike doesn't drop in. Right? He doesn't drop in. There isn't an in to drop in. It's rather that Frank drops him in the poem. Molly, any thought on this? I mean, is it it's mind-blowing, but...
Yeah, it's a little mind-blowing, but I mean, it's true. How do you make a painting about making a painting about sardines?
And you know what's so charming about O'Hara, Molly, is that he can pull this off. This could be a long 25-page theoretical paper, easily.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they've been written about postmodernity and about the difference between writing and depicting, right? But this is a I'm drinking and I go around and I have friends kind of poem that does all this theoretical work under the charm. Why do you like that? It's kind of an open question, but say something about his, I don't know, O'Hara's style, temperament, personality that you like.
I mean, it's a little smarmy towards the end. I am a real poet. My poem is finished and I haven't mentioned orange yet, and it's kind of.
Is that a boast, or
I mean,
self-criticism?
I don't think it's a self-criticism. I think it's not exactly a boast, but he's saying that I can go a step further.
And that last
my
line is
friend can.
such like a zinger too.
Yeah.
And then I
Right.
see Mike's painting in the gallery.
Right.
And that's that.
And it's called Sardines.
One thing. you
What's
know.
he saying, Max, about Mike's painting?
Well, he's saying that it can't go on in the same way that the poem can.
It's done.
Yeah, it's done.
The poem goes on and
Yeah.
on and
Yeah.
on. The poem is really never finished. Now there are some conceptual artists or just, I'm going to say plain old painters, but you know what I mean, who will continue to revise. But you know, there is a time when especially when it gets, but poems, Leaves of Grass, I mean,
He revised his whole life. I mean,
he revised it his whole life. Anna, say anything about this poem by way of wrapping up.
I think one of my favorite things about it is that in this poem you really get that relationship between the painters and the poets of the New York School who
Yeah.
were working together in this
Yes.
time. And I think this is where you really get a sense of how close that relationship was and how mutually beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
But also, this is the kind of poetry you get from this relationship.
Yeah, very good. Allie, final word? Any thoughts at all?
Yeah, I also just think that the rhythm, especially in the third stanza, kind of just like enacts the fact that he can't stop.
To give us an example.
Pretty soon is a whole page of words, not lines, and another page there should be so much more, not of oranges of words, of how terrible oranges in life is. It keeps going. And
There's a lot of energy there.
The momentum itself just kind of
Yeah.
carries.
It's almost as if he's saying, you know, you want action painting?
Yeah.
I'll give you action poem. There's a lot of action. Yeah.
That's why
Dave, final thought?
That's why I like how he says, Mike said, it was too much about the sardines. And as the poem Oranges, and this poem shows for O'Hara, there is no too much.
There is no such thing as too much. In fact, O'Hara as a person his friends just always thought of him as too much, but in a very positive way. Oh, Frank, he's just too much. Amaris, final thought?
I guess he further underscores the sort of plurality and complexity that's possible in poetry by saying that he has 12 poems at the end, whereas Goldberg seems to be constrained by the single canvas. And we can imagine that several more poems could come out that are all associated with each other out of this initial inspiration of Oranges. So it seems that at the end of the day, poetry is the more open form for O'Hara.
Cool. Emily, I guess you get the last word. I don't know why that always happens.
Okay. I guess I like how this poem, the sort of presumptuousness of it and how he claims for himself the capacity of pretty much every artistic discipline. And then in the process reinvents what poetry means itself. That really funny line, it is even in prose, I am a real poet. So the one sort of concrete sort of definition of poetry as a artistic discipline, he just throws out the window and still maintains that he is a poet. It's charming.
It's charming. Let's raise our Mott Poe and Kelly Writers House cups to Frank O'Hara. Cheers, Frank.